In the Final Fantasy series, there is one game that everyone seems to hate. Final Fantasy XIII places consistently low on popularity polls and is often referenced as when Final Fantasy went wrong. People will say the release of Final Fantasy XIII marked the end of the series' golden age. Why is it that this game in particular is so disliked by the community that it is still being discussed today, 15 years later? How is it that one game could leave such a bad impression, especially when that game is one of my personal favorites, and at the time, the fastest selling Final Fantasy ever released? Is the game actually bad, or was it ahead of its time? This is the story of the most hated Final Fantasy game. To begin with, we have to go back to before the release of Final Fantasy XIII. Final Fantasy XII released in March of 2006 and was very well received by critics. The online reception from fans was somewhat mixed, but mostly positive. There's a lot that I could say about Final Fantasy XII, but I'll save that for another video. The important part to remember is that the game featured the Gambit system, which allowed you to automate your party and have them make decisions based on how you set up their gambits. You could freely control the entire party or none of the party based on your preference. It also allowed free movement during battle and, for its time, expansive maps that were pretty similar to what you would see in an MMO. Development of FF13 began in 2004, and Square Enix had some very ambitious goals. Motomu Toriyama, the director of the game, thought up the mythology for a series of games called the Fabula Nova Crystallis series. He went on to create a story based on the mythology that was going to tie together these games. This game was Final Fantasy XIII. In May 2005, a year before the release of Final Fantasy XII, Square would unveil a tech demo for the PlayStation 3, an infamous tech demo of Final Fantasy VII. This created an incredible amount of hype among the fans, as does anything related to 7. The idea of a remake, sequel, or remaster has always been heavily discussed within the fanbase, and this tech demo was the start of a lot of it, or at least the inspiration for a lot of it. The success of the tech demo led to the decision to continue development for their next Final Fantasy game on PlayStation 3 instead of on PlayStation 2. Square's idea was that by creating a new game engine, it would actually speed up development later in the project after a short initial delay. This delay ended up being much longer than anticipated because the game engine actually had to be created for multiple planned games, not just Final Fantasy XIII. At E3 2006, Square would officially announce Final Fantasy XIII, along with the now infamous Final Fantasy Versus 13, which, as you may know, was later retitled to Final Fantasy 15. Final Fantasy Type 0 was also announced at the same event. The idea was that each game would not be directly related story-wise, but would be linked by theme. These 3 games would form the Fabula Nova Crystallis series that Toriyama had envisioned back in 2004. Many of the developers of Final Fantasy XIII worked on other games in the series. The director, Toriyama, worked on Final Fantasy X, while the battle system director for the game was the same director for Final Fantasy X. The goal of the development team was for Final Fantasy XIII to have the same gameplay impact that 7 and 10 had both had on their respective consoles. Toriyama said that he believed the game would be the ultimate single-player RPG. In December of 2009, 13 released in Japan, and it was met with positive reviews. One Japanese gaming magazine rated it 39 out of 40, while Dengeki said the game deserved a score of 120 because 100 would not be enough. Among the things to praise about the game were the graphics, and interestingly enough, the battle system. If you look online today though, you'll find a ton of mixed feedback about the battle system, especially if you go back to online forums from shortly after the game's release. While the critic reviews were positive, they failed to reach the standard expected of Final Fantasy at this point. After release, Toriyama would respond to the lower than expected review scores. He said that he felt the lower scores came from reviewers who approached the game from a Western point of view. He said that Western games gave the player an open world to explore, and that this expectation clashed with what the team was trying to create. Toriyama said it becomes very difficult to tell a compelling story when you're given that much freedom. The producer of the game said, "We didn't really intend to work within the RPG template, but wanted to create a new game, even a new genre." He also said, in a lot of senses, Final Fantasy XIII is more like an FPS than an RPG. These quotes alone say a lot about how 13 ended up with such mixed reception and carries such a poor reputation to this day. For many people, and for many years, Square Enix was considered the king of the RPG genre. Final Fantasy was, and by many still is, the gold standard of RPGs. This was even more true back then than it is now. Square had just finished an absolute gauntlet of amazing games, each of which had huge impacts on the industry as a whole. They dropped Final Fantasy 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 12 in a row. Final Fantasy 11, as it was an MMO, was not considered a real mainline game by many fans at the time. When people talk about the golden age of Final Fantasy, they're often talking about games from this time period. These 6 games were released in a 12-year period, an average of one game every 2 years, starting with the Super Nintendo and ending at the very end of the PS2 era. For reference, there were almost 7 years between Final Fantasy 15 and 16. In that same length of time, Square had given us 6, 7, 8, 9, with 10 just about to release. When you are the undisputed king of RPGs and your series is the gold standard of RPGs, it is going to come as a shock to your fans when the producer of your newest game says, "This game is more like an FPS than an RPG." In an interview, Yoichi Wada, then president of Square Enix, said, "Some value it highly and some are not very happy with it. Should Final Fantasy become a new type of game, or should Final Fantasy not become a new type of game? The customers have different opinions. It's very difficult to determine which way it should go." This quote from 2010 has never been more relevant to the series than it is today in 2024. Anybody who plays Final Fantasy can instantly think of many ways that this applies to the current state of the series. I'm not going to dive into it right now because this video is about 13 specifically, but I will be mentioning this again later as well as in future videos. The first thing to talk about is the story of 13. I won't dive into an analysis of the story itself, but instead how the story is told. The game starts by throwing you directly into the action, which is actually a refreshing change of pace for RPGs. Within the first moments of the game, you are bombarded with story-related terms and references. Words like l'Cie, fal'Cie, pulse, cocoon, psycom, and sanctum are all thrown at you without context and within the first scenes of the game. The game received, and still does receive, a lot of criticism for this. While there's a ton of information to take in, this is pretty common in this type of media, especially with science fiction style stories. I can understand why they decided to tell the story this way. By doing this, they avoided the trope of JRPGs in particular, of info dumping and explaining every single bit of the game's lore piece by piece. They went for a show don't tell approach to storytelling, and I actually do really like that. In my opinion, the cutscenes and dialogue that happen within the game explain what is happening enough to be able to follow along with the story. The general consensus, though, is that the story was confusing and needlessly complex. Many critics reference the story of the game as a negative in their reviews, and it does make sense why. One of the most controversial parts of the game was the inclusion of datalogs. Datalogs are accessible through the menu and contain information about the game's lore. A lot of backstory and context for the story is explained through datalogs. It is very similar to the active time lore system in Final Fantasy 16. In 16, if you pause the game during a cutscene, the game provides you with information and context about the characters, story, and lore surrounding them. This is a widely praised system, and something that I would love to see in more games. Datalogs, however, were not widely praised. There is a ton of criticism online, and datalogs are one of the main complaints I hear about the game's story. Why is 16's system so heavily praised, while 13 is so despised? The first thing to come to mind is that 16's version is very convenient. When watching a cutscene, you don't need to take a mental note of something, then open up the menu afterward, find the entry, and read it. You hit pause, and the information is right on the screen for you. In 13, you need to intentionally go out of your way to the datalog menu and find what it is that you would like to know. I don't think that this is the real reason why people dislike the datalog system so much, though. The real reason is what I mentioned earlier. Show don't tell storytelling. In 16, when you use the active time lore, it's because you want clarification on something that you're already interested in and is happening on screen. The story is being told to you, the player, directly, and you're choosing to delve further into the lore or to get reminded about something if you so choose. The active time lore system gives extra information that you can read if you want to. It does not include crucial parts of the story, which is the case for 13. It's the difference between having this information available to you if you want additional information and you want extra world building, versus having some pretty important plot points hidden away in a menu. To clarify, I do think that the story is told well enough through cutscenes and dialogue that you don't need to use a datalog to follow the story. I do think that it is the case that you would need to use a datalog to fully understand the story, especially toward the end of the game. To this day, if you look up the words Final Fantasy XIII story, you will find an incredible amount of posts. You'll see people asking for explanations of what happened, you'll see people trying to make sense of the ending, you'll see people calling it the worst story in Final Fantasy history. You'll even find this 97-page Google document explaining the lore of Final Fantasy XIII and making sense of the story. While I personally like the way the story was told, there's no doubt that it's a departure from the way the series would typically tell their stories, and that most people simply didn't like it. I said that the story of 13 throws you directly into it. The gameplay, however, definitely does not. The biggest point of criticism I have seen about 13 is the gameplay. Undeniably, this game is a hallway simulator. Almost every single area in the game is a series of corridors leading you to the next cutscene. There is an exception. One specific chapter of the game is an open world type area, and to be fair, it is massive. There is plenty to explore, lots of secrets to find, and a ton of optional side quests. It's no surprise that this chapter is often considered to be the best part of the game by many people. With that said, exploration for almost the entire game is essentially non-existent. The exploration is limited to going down a dead-end path that you can clearly see on your minimap. There is no ability to go off the beaten path whatsoever. I think it's literally impossible to get lost in this game, and there really are no secrets to find outside of that one specific chapter. The environments are varied, the graphics are incredible, but at the end of the day, it really does feel like you are just walking down the same corridor, painted different colors. This is a huge contrast to almost every other Final Fantasy game, where you can backtrack when you want to, there are secrets and side quests, hidden items, and a full world to explore. In 13, backtracking isn't possible. There are no secrets or side quests, and hidden items are basically always clearly visible. I think a huge reason for not feeling immersed in the world is the lack of towns or NPCs to interact with. A lot of the world building in these types of games happens through exploring the world, visiting towns, seeing the culture of the world, and getting immersed in it. In 13, this doesn't happen at all outside of maybe one or two very limited scenes. You basically never interact with an NPC in this game. Something that has to be mentioned is that RPGs will usually use non-playable characters as a way to immerse yourself in the world, especially through dialogue. It provides a natural way for players to learn more about the world if they would like to. Players who don't want to do this can just choose not to do it. They can just go to their destination. In my opinion, this is likely why the datalogs exist to begin with. It provides you with information that you would normally learn through interacting with the world and people in it. The same world and people that 13 doesn't have. People bring up how linear the game is a lot. But how linear is it really compared to the previous games? Well, 10 was also kind of a hallway simulator, and it was also criticized for a lack of exploration when it was released. Even with that, it is still often regarded as the best Final Fantasy game of all time, or at least among the best. Okay, so 10 was also linear, but that didn't make people dislike it. What about the older games? Well, they're definitely not open world. To be honest, basically all of these games are, to an extent, linear. There is always going to be a correct way to progress the story and a correct place to go. The difference is that these games give you the option to explore if you want to. You aren't directly walking from point A to point B unless that's what you want to do, and players are rewarded for going off the beaten path and intentionally trying to find things. There's hidden items, sometimes there's secret areas. There are towns to explore full of NPCs to talk to, who will provide you with interesting information about the world they live in that you may want to know more about. The older Final Fantasy games are definitely not open world, but they do give the illusion of an open world. They don't give you complete freedom to explore the world as you see fit. However, as you progress, the amount of areas you can access will increase, and you get to explore those areas as you go. Yes, you do have to go from point A to point B, but there's plenty of things to do between those 2 points, at least if you want to do those things. Toriyama said it becomes very difficult to tell a compelling story when you're given that much freedom. This may be true, however with 13 in particular, people felt like they had no world to explore or learn about. They would walk forward, fight the mandatory battles, and eventually encounter a cutscene or boss. There was no option to not always move forward. Something that I want to mention here is that in the context of the story, the linearity and lack of towns does actually make sense. Throughout the entire game, the party is on the run. They are fugitives from start to finish, and the citizens of their world are terrified of them. It does make sense in the context of the story, but I think that there is probably more lost by not including towns and people than there is gained by adhering to the pace of the story. I honestly like the linearity of the game. I thought the story was interesting and the combat was really engaging, so it actually worked well for me. Some people have a preference for one over the other, and considering this was the most straightforward game yet, it's no surprise why so many people would instantly lose interest. In the case of 10, while the game did not feature any sort of open world, it still provided towns and NPCs constantly. There were still ways to backtrack to find treasure, and there was more than just combat to break up each section of the game. This gave the world a sense of completeness that 13 simply didn't have, and stopped the gameplay from feeling like you were just moving from cutscene to cutscene. While I personally enjoyed it a lot, I can see why it would not be for everyone. RPGs and JRPGs in particular are no stranger to having a slow start. You can look up almost any of them and find posts asking, when does this game get good? Final Fantasy itself is pretty known for this. 14, for example, is infamous for taking a while to get good. Throughout 13, you were slowly introduced to new parts of the combat system. Very slowly. For reference, there are 13 chapters in the game, and people often cite the combat of the first 5 to 7 chapters as a sort of tutorial. In Chapter 7, for example, you are still being introduced to new parts of the combat system, purely basic parts of the combat system at that. With that said, how much the game falls into this category depends on the player. I do think that it's undeniable, regardless of how slowly you pick up the combat system, it still takes too long to introduce everything to the player. So what even is the combat system? The combat system is called Command Synergy Battle. The system is basically a variant of the ATB or Active Time Battle system from other games. Each character has their own ATB gauge. In 13, you directly control only one character at a time. The other two will perform actions based on the role that you assign to them. Each character, including the one you control, will behave differently and have access to different abilities based on the assigned role. A paradigm is the combination of 3 roles. Paradigm shifting is the main mechanic of this system. So, for example, you could have a paradigm that makes one character act as a tank, while another character acts as a healer and the other acts as a DPS. This would be useful for surviving situations with heavy damage. Then, once the high damage has stopped, you could swap your party to be 3 damage dealing roles to optimize DPS. The roles available are Sentinel, which would be a tanky role for surviving high damage, Medic, which is your standard healer role, Commando, which has very high raw damage and maintains the chain gauge, which we'll get to soon. Ravager is your standard DPS. It doesn't maintain the chain gauge, but instead increases it very rapidly. Saboteur debuffs enemies, also maintains the chain gauge just like Commando. Synergist will buff allies with things like Brave and Haste. 2 main features of the combat system are the chain gauge as well as stagger. As you attack an enemy, you will increase the chain gauge. The Commando and Saboteur roles are very good at maintaining the chain gauge. They increase the gauge slightly, but they mainly stop it from decreasing. The Ravager role, however, does not maintain the gauge well and instead increases it very rapidly. This creates a ton of room for optimization. Sure, you could just use one paradigm with 1 Commando and 2 Ravagers, but why not swap between 2 paradigms, one of them having 3 Ravagers? This way you can increase the gauge faster, swapping back to Commando when you needed to maintain it. This, of course, introduces a risk. If you're swapping to Ravager when you shouldn't, then maybe you take damage and need to heal. Well, unless you have a paradigm that has a healer and a Commando, you could now lose all the progress you made on that chain gauge. Once you do fill the chain gauge, an enemy is staggered. This is when you get to deal big damage, and even then, you get to make a lot of decisions. When an enemy is staggered, you deal bonus damage. This multiplier is represented here. The Commando will deal the most damage outright, however the Ravager will increase the multiplier very fast, at the cost of dealing less damage than the Commando. So you have to make a decision, based on the health of the enemy and how much time they are staggered for, what the best move is. Do you use all Ravagers to increase the multiplier to max, then swap to Commando to deal a ton of damage? Do you immediately swap to Commando right away because it's a low health enemy or maybe the stagger bar is falling too fast to build up the multiplier? Are you low health and you need to heal before the stagger ends? It's a very engaging combat system and probably the most involved system Final Fantasy has had up to this point. I could talk about the combat and how good it is all day. It is one of my favorite combat systems in any game I've ever played. If you've played 16 or 7 Remake, you're probably realizing something. The main combat system for both of these games is inspired by the combat system used in 13. They polished it and refined it, but at its core, the chain gauge and stagger system seems to be the new standard combat system of Final Fantasy. The problem with 13 is that it takes an extremely long time to introduce these systems and let players customize it as they see fit. Once the game opens up and you have access to all of the characters and roles, things get really interesting. The catch is that this doesn't happen until really far into the game. It's around chapter 9 or 10 before that finally happens, and there are large sections of the game where you don't even have 3 characters, you only have 2. This limits your options massively. There's no doubt that many people dropped the game before they got to a point where the combat really takes off. And as much as I like this game, I don't blame them. It's unreasonable to expect someone to spend 10, 20 hours or more playing a game that they don't find fun in hopes that it will eventually get fun. I think something that is very important to note is that 13 receives a lot of criticism for being an auto battle game. Based on my thoughts on the combat system, I clearly don't think this is true. It is absolutely true, though, that for most players, the game will seem that way. First of all, the main button you are hitting in combat is auto battle. This picks the best actions for you based on your selected role. This may sound weird, but it makes a lot of sense. The combat happens way too fast in 13 for it to be realistic to manually input every action, even for one character, let alone controlling all three. The real gameplay is controlling your party using the paradigm shift mechanic, and the auto battle button is just a way to tell your character to take an action. You can select abilities manually, and in some cases you should do this. The character's ultimate abilities, for example, do not happen as part of auto battle and will need to be manually selected when required. Due to how slowly the game introduces new mechanics, it is very likely that most players simply quit the game before most mechanics were available. To these players, it really will look like they are just hitting auto battle and winning, and to be honest, for a large chunk of the game, they are right. I believe this is where the criticism comes from. The game actually does have an engaging combat system, but the combination of introducing it way too slowly and players losing interest by that point make it seem like the game is just click auto battle and move on. In an interview in 2011, Toriyama said that the biggest complaints that they heard about the game was that it was too linear, that there was not enough interaction between the player and the world, and that the gameplay elements were introduced too slowly. The characters of Final Fantasy XIII are all very unique, and is one of the things that was most praised by critics when the game released. The online feedback, however, was quite a mixed bag. People who have played 13 already know where this section of the video is going. Some characters were seen as annoying. 3 in particular seemed to be very disliked by many people. One of those 3, however, stood out as being particularly annoying. This character is Hope. I'm not going to dive deep into the story arc, but there's no doubt that for some people, the characters are a weak point in this game. I personally like the story arcs of the characters. I thought they were all fleshed out fairly well. Each character has some significant character development moments throughout, but there is absolutely no doubt that there were some irritating moments mixed in. I won't go any further into the character developments as it's not really the focus of the video, but it's just worth noting that generally the characters were perceived positively with mixed reception online. It wasn't a particularly strong part of the game for many people, but it wasn't particularly bad either. I just want to add in, this is in my opinion, there are some people who absolutely hate all of the characters in this game. Just to be clear, and if you don't like them, that's fair enough. I think this part in particular depends a lot on personal taste. Final Fantasy games generally offer some level of customization within the game itself. This varies heavily, ranging from complete control over your character and their job and their skills, their abilities, to having no control over many of these things at all. In 13, characters gain abilities and stats by spending points in the Crystarium. This system is simple and straightforward. You get Crystarium points from battle, and you spend those points in the Crystarium to improve your characters. Each character has access to 3 main roles, and later each character can access all roles. You are very heavily encouraged to level up only their 3 main roles for the main game, because all of the other roles for each character will cost a ton of points. Within each role, each character levels up following basically a straight line. There are very few deviations, and ultimately you will simply end up spending points to move forward to the next part of the Crystarium. This system is very similar to 10's standard sphere grid, not the expert grid. I don't see the Crystarium as an issue, and I haven't really heard people complain about it. One thing that is worth noting is that you expand the Crystarium by progressing the story. This means that there is effectively a cap on how much you can grind. No matter how many Crystarium points you have, you will reach a point where you will need to progress the story to move forward. That said, you are still able to grind to upgrade your weapons and accessories if you'd like, although it isn't necessary. It's just worth mentioning that unlike many other games in the series, you aren't really able to just grind to overcome a difficult boss, which some people may not like. The main point of customization in 13 comes from the paradigm system itself. Once you have all characters available, you are free to change your battle team, including the character you control, as you see fit. This means that you can put together any combination of roles that you want. You can mix and match as you like, and there are plenty of possibilities. But what is it about this game in particular that makes so many people dislike it compared to the rest of the series? Why do some people feel that this marks the end of the golden age of Final Fantasy? Well, it's a really hard question to answer. I think that there are some elements that are key to making a game feel like Final Fantasy to players. You'll often hear fans wish that Final Fantasy could go back to their classic style or find its identity again. But what does that really mean? What is classic Final Fantasy to one person may not be classic Final Fantasy for another. The gap between 2024 and the release of 13 is a bigger gap than the amount of time between the release of 7 and 13. For some people, 13 is going to be classic Final Fantasy. What is Final Fantasy to you? When you think of it, do you think of a turn-based, menu-based RPG system? Do you think of the ATB system in any of its incarnations? If you think of the ATB system, do you also count 12 and 13 as having ATB gauges? Both of those games do technically use ATB. Do you think of straightforward, story-based experiences like 10? If that's the case, do you also like 13 for the same reasons? Final Fantasy has never been a static series, and Square Enix has always been trying to innovate. If they didn't, Final Fantasy would simply still be a turn-based, menu-based RPG. And it's valid if you prefer that. As Square Enix president Yoichi Wada asked, should Final Fantasy become a new type of game, or should Final Fantasy not become a new type of game? The customers have different opinions. It's very difficult to determine which way it should go. I believe that while Final Fantasy has always been changing and always trying to innovate, there are specific key elements that people expect from a Final Fantasy game that make it feel like it belongs to the series. The amount that each element matters will depend on the person. This is why some people like myself really enjoy 13, while other people couldn't stand it. Each mainline Final Fantasy game, especially those from the Golden Age, tend to be very heavily story-based. In some games, the story is more about the world and the characters, but ultimately the stories of the characters and how they interact with the world also matters a lot. Along with this, people expect a Final Fantasy game to be party-based, and for the characters to have intertwining stories. They are a band of unlikely people adventuring together. People really value the party-based gameplay and storytelling of these games. For example, people really hated not being able to directly control all characters at once in 13. It was one of the biggest complaints by quite a lot. The combat system, however, was one of the most engaging that they had ever created. It's a shame that most people quit before they got to the point where the combat got good. It doesn't make sense to blame the players for quitting though. It is, after all, the developer's job to make the game engaging for players and to hook them early on. Square Enix sacrificed some of the party-based element of the combat to create a better, more engaging combat system. I wonder if players would have been more receptive to this change if the good combat system became apparent earlier in the game. It is also possible that people simply don't want the combat system that is not party-based, regardless of how engaging it could be. Some of the most popular Final Fantasy games are widely different in combat gameplay. 10, for example, is strictly turn-based. 7, on the other hand, is seen as one of the most impactful games of all time, and was ATB-based. I think that for most people who like Final Fantasy games, it is not the type of combat that matters so much, rather it's the party-based nature of that gameplay. A player might prefer ATB or turn-based, but ultimately, they will enjoy either as long as the story, characters, and world are engaging. It's less about the combat system directly and more how the characters are expressed using those systems. It's not difficult to have Wakka attack the flying enemy while Riku deals with the mechanical enemy, but it does make each character unique. I found 13's gameplay very fun and engaging, but if you don't care about the combat and would prefer to explore a world, then 13 will not be enjoyable for you. While the series doesn't typically have an open world, it seems important that players feel like they are immersed in and exploring a world. Backtracking, hidden items, new towns, and areas with different paths all help with creating familiarity and adventure. Everyone knows that feeling of finally unlocking the airship and having free roam of the world. Ultimately, you still need to go to a specific point to progress the story, but you have the option to do other things. At the very least, the illusion of a vast world is something that players will expect. It's hard to talk about Final Fantasy without mentioning the music. All it takes is a couple of notes, and I can guarantee that a large portion of the people watching this had a visceral reaction to hearing that. How about this? Music is very important to Final Fantasy, and definitely one of the most memorable parts of each game. Having a bad soundtrack won't ruin a game, but having a very good soundtrack can make an experience so much better. I'll also mention the graphics. I think that for most people, graphics are not that important, but historically, Final Fantasy has always pushed the boundaries graphically. It may not look like much now, but this game was groundbreaking at the time of release. Even with 13's mixed reception, there's no doubt that the graphics were absolutely incredible. 16 recently released, and like always, Final Fantasy is still being praised for its graphics. It's something that Square clearly values heavily, and it might be more important to Final Fantasy than you think. The last element I'll mention is combat. I think this is one of the things that has the most variance. Final Fantasy doesn't really have a standard combat system. Even the ones that are regarded as the best often have very different systems among them. Final Fantasy XIV, for example, is incredibly story-based. The game is mostly dialogue and cutscenes, with a lot of traveling through the world in between. The actual dungeon or combat gameplay doesn't happen very often as you make your way through the main story. You spend most of your time experiencing the story of the world and the characters in it. This is a game where people will commonly say it takes at least 50 hours of mostly reading and walking before it will get good. Despite this, it has performed extremely well in popularity polls recently, often ranking higher than some of the absolute classics. Players definitely do like good combat, and having a good combat system absolutely does matter, but in the case of 13, Square relied very heavily on an engaging combat system that plenty of players didn't even stick around for long enough to experience. Even if they had, it's not clear if it is worth sacrificing other elements that matter to players, such as party interactions, just to have a better combat system. Good combat is important, but it may not be that important to the average Final Fantasy player when you have to sacrifice other more important elements for that thing. Out of all of the elements I discussed, 13 chose to focus heavily on the story and the combat. But to do this, they sacrificed two elements that might be the most important to many players. I'll happily play a game with a bad story, or no story at all, but a great combat system. As long as it's fun, it's all good. I'll also play a game for the story, even if the combat is not exactly groundbreaking. Some people don't want to play a game only for the gameplay, and other people don't want to play a game only for the story. Final Fantasy in particular is known for its characters and story, so if you have to sacrifice either, then people are likely going to have an issue with that. In 13's case, they focused on making the combat engaging and keeping the pace of the story, but this came at the cost of world building, exploration, and party interaction. Along with this, party control was also lost, something that is important to many players. The engaging combat system didn't pay off, and in my opinion, it's largely because people simply lost interest before reaching that payoff. Even if they had, it's hard to say if the sacrifice of the other elements would have made it worth it. With that said, 13 did pave the way for Final Fantasy XVI's combat system, and in particular, Final Fantasy VII Remake's combat system. 7 Remake in particular has received universal praise, with many people hoping that this combat system becomes the new standard for Final Fantasy. You have complete control of all characters, with unique abilities, personalities, strength, and weaknesses that are all expressed through combat. Even if you didn't like 13 or 13's combat system in general, it inspired what many people consider to be the best combat system in Final Fantasy so far. 7 Remake's combat system builds the party-based element that people love about Final Fantasy into the combat itself, and it seems to have made a huge difference. Thanks for watching. If you're interested in more content like this, let me know down below. The algorithm works in mysterious ways, and every like or comment really does make a difference. For me personally, 13 is one of my favorite in the series, and I really enjoyed both the gameplay and the story. What do you think of Final Fantasy 13, and what is the most important part of Final Fantasy to you?